Okay, so let's take a look at Chapter 3. We'll be talking more about technology and some of the concepts around what we call e-business. This idea of technology, we talked a bit about the characteristics of technology, one of the key characteristics being one of continuous change, is always evolving, continuing to move from one form to another. Within that, though, there are certain technologies which have really been noteworthy or have been noted as being particularly disruptive. Um, the four examples, probably the four best examples we'd see over the past 30, 40 years would be in the 80s, the introduction of the IBM personal computer. In the 90s, the introduction and utilization of the internet. In the early 2000s, the introduction of virtualized computing, basically changing the computing paradigm from a physical hardware to more of a virtual platform. And then over the past probably 10 years, that's the idea of mobility, really triggered by the introduction of the iPhone and the ability to interact on a mobile basis to anything, resources on the internet. So those are the four. Those are four disruptive technologies. All technologies, can have impact, but not all are disruptive. So as we'll show here in this diagram, this is actually from Gartner Group last year. This is a list of what Gartner has identified as disruptive technologies. So some of these will actually be impactful, but to be truly disruptive, not every technology is a truly disruptive technology. But a couple of the categories that Gartner have identified: machine learning, artificial intelligence, continued artificial intelligence, and advanced machine learning. It's the idea of intelligent applications, intelligent things, the idea of the Internet of Things applying network connectivity into virtually every device and making it accessible on the internet. From a digital perspective, some of the disruptive technologies would be things like virtual reality, augmented reality, like for example, the ability to embed a computer or visual display into a pair of glasses or actually onto your retina. So as you're going around, information can be uh, recovered and presented to you in real time. Uh, Blockchains, which is really we see it with Bitcoin, but this idea of new forms of digital currency that's being developed right now, it's a hot item right now, very volatile environment. So how exactly this will play out remains to be seen. And this idea of what we call a mesh environment. So, basically everything connected to everything, kind of a variant of what we talk about intelligent things, but also being able to interconnect all these intelligent things. So as the term that gets used, here we'll probably talk about this is what we call the Internet of Things. So as we said, not all technologies, technologies to a degree, all technology have some characteristics of, because a lot of it are driven by change, they're impactful. But the question of which ones of these will be truly disruptive, which ones will really drive, and that is really to be seen. So some of the ones that are truly disruptive, as we identified here, besides the four we talked about, we did talk about the internet. Web 2.0, Web 3.0, where we went from the web being just simply a presentation vehicle to one where you actually would interact and do e-commerce. Mobility, which we talked about, kind of marked by the iPhone, the introduction of the iPhone, and this idea of an entire market, entire industry built around this idea of mobile computing. The Internet of Things, where we're seeing wearable, flyable, drivable technology, technology really universally distributed into every device. Cloud computing, which is kind of taking virtualization and linking it with the internet and providing the ability to uh, access computing resources across the internet. Um, Cognitive artificial intelligence, basically getting a continued um, enhancement and improvement of artificial intelligence to the point where we can derive applications that can that more closely simulate cognitive activity. And finally, blockchain, as we talked around, blockchain, Bitcoin, blockchain, and new forms of digital currency and commerce. So the internet, so we talked about disruptive activity, disruptive technologies. I mean, probably arguably the one that has probably had the most impact on a global basis over the past 30 years or so has been the internet. And the internet is a relatively not so much the internet itself. The internet is actually predates going back to the 70s, but the internet in terms of an interactive area that people would go to is really relatively recent. So it was Sir Tim Berners-Lee's innovation of what they call the World Wide Web. All right, so the World Wide Web is part of the internet. World Wide Web piggybacks on top of the internet. The internet is actually a communication network. The web resides on top of that and uses the internet. And it really provides the standards by which information is shared now. So what will happen is basically just the mechanics of how the web works is in its simplest form is you have a client machine, you have a server. A client will send a message, send a request, and a browser will send a request over something called HTTP, which is a transport protocol, hypertext transport protocol. Basically, send a request to a server requesting a piece of information. And the server will receive that request, look up the information, and then return it. All right, and then the browser will take the information as received, which is in the form of what they call HTML, hypertext markup language, and then present it on the screen. So it's a very simple um, construct. At the core, it's a very simple mechanism. Um, Part of the challenges is trying to establish and maintain the standards. So the idea of the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, has really been very successful and very impactful in developing and maintaining the internet standards. Because if somebody starts creating one-off or variants on what the standard is, then basically um, it fails pretty quickly. So the implementation, part of it is this, the strength of the internet. Part of it is its simplicity, and also the adherence, the definition, and the adherence of the rules are have been really critical in the success. Here's kind of the evolution of the web. So we look at Web 1.0. We'd be starting in March of 1991. It was about 100,000 websites. Um, you would send requests and you would put requests in, and it was really a document-oriented system. The original design that Berners-Lee had created was around a document-based collaboration model for researchers. So that was really the Web 2.0. Web 1.0. Web 2.0 is where we kind of move from a read-only to a more of an interactive, a read-write model. So the idea of e-commerce, if you think about a sales transaction, where you put a request in to purchase something, you submit, critical information, you select the product, you submit payment, and information for shipping, and then you know the recipient will then send the information back out. So what you saw was really is a huge growth, from 100,000 websites to 100 million websites. With kind of this web uh, 2.0 model. Part of it is the simplicity of uh, the internet, the basic internet mechanisms really lend itself to the scalability. So if you keep something very simple, then you know you can repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, as opposed to something with a lot of complexity or a lot of interdependencies, which tend you get to a certain point and things start become very complicated to scale. So a large portion of what and how you get from 100,000 to 100 million is really the scalability of the internet, and then the additional functionality. As we get into this Web 3.0, which is really kind of where we're at right now, is combining um, this interactive capability with additional capabilities. We say both in the size, the scale, the numbers of potential users, the numbers of websites, up to 1 billion websites, and then adding additional, besides just simply content and interaction, we also add intelligence. We've seen this is a story that has been evolving since '91 and continues to evolve even to this day. This idea of so when we talked about Web 2.0, one of the big innovations with Web 2.0 was kind of adapting it for business use. All right. So this idea of e-business is say here is not more than just e-commerce, right? It's really a combination of things. It's used in around productivity, communication, collaboration, and so it's not just any one thing. E-commerce is kind of one um, dimension of it, but the reality is there's a number of different dimensions to it. Um, and depending upon how a business positions itself, what its strategy is, what its market is, and how it approaches things, it can use um, e-commerce or e-business in different ways. All right, so some of the advantages, obviously, global reach. It used to be before, if you were a selling something, if you were a sales organization, you got customers would come into your store. Now there was always exceptions to that. If you look at our example of Sears Roebuck, with catalog sales, so they had kind of that was a think of Sears as a 19th century, early 20th century Amazon.com, kind of what that is. But the idea of being able to now global reach, no physical limitations, really, that anybody can buy anything from any location. Um, this idea of new markets, so the ability to customize, personalize, user experience, and being able to reach different types of customers in different ways. The ability, these are the types of things that you have the ability that organizations have leveraged using e-business. Um, the idea of reducing cost. If you look at the entire, across the back end or the front end of the back end, sorry, the back end of the value chain. Getting products to customers, the logistics are associated with that, and getting it to into a store, through the warehousing, through the supply chain, into customers' hands. A lot of cost with that. So the idea with e-business is you can actually interact directly with the customer and eliminate things like your overhead of your physical facilities, of reducing inventory management, cutting out intermediaries, reducing the number of players, and interacting directly with the customer. So it's one of the key features in as we look at this, that has really kind of driven the utilization of it. And then effectiveness, the idea of um, that you can create a website that people would come back to. You know, a classic case of this is going to be Amazon.com using a combination of its web's design and how it and basically how it engages customers in ways that can, and then leveraging the information that gets gathered through the experience, through clicks and then analyzing customer activities and being able to discern what a customer might want, anticipate what customer might want, and then translating that into a basically into a revenue um, through engagement and ongoing interactivities. So it's a combination of a number of things. The advantages are multidimensional, and you know it enables organizations actually can get into the game, whereas before you had large physical infrastructures required um, in different markets. Basically, e-business enables you to kind of cut that, reduce that, and then position yourselves and be able to provide yourself a competitive position in the market without necessarily large investment. So for all the advantages, though, there's also challenges. All right, so it's you don't get things for nothing. And there's as with anything, there are challenges that need to be understood, recognized, and mitigated. So a couple of things when we look at e-business, the things you want to take a look at. One is this idea of customer trust. You're dealing not with a face-to-face. In a normal sales experience, customers are dealing face-to-face with customer service representatives or salespeople. Um, Within e-business, there's a one-off. Basically, you're dealing directly through a web interface. So the idea of being able to build a trustworthy relationship um, with a customer and be able to maintain and sustain that is can be challenging. And I think one of the things that you point out here is that the double-edged sword around social media. An organization that runs afoul and betrays customer trust usually can face a significant backlash in terms of in social media, negative social media, which can have a big impact on. I think we've seen situations where if something becomes, for example, um, a lot of cases issues are encountered with security, like information, customer information becoming exposed has become a big issue with and companies have had pretty major impact in having to deal with that. So, say for example, um, well, Target was actually a security issue, but with companies getting their information that's captured in their e-business systems and being hacked and becoming exposing customer information, putting it at risk. And as we say here about security and perfection, the information, the value of the information is paramount in maintaining and sustaining customer trust. And organizations that have had that problem have had to deal with the outcomes with um, from the consumer side of losing access or losing control of the data and exposing their customers. Um, Security becomes more and more of an issue because what happens is if you're not dealing with somebody face to face, you're dealing interface to interface, web interface to application. How do we really know that person? On both sides, how do you know from consumer side that what you're connecting to is really that company? Amazon.com really is Amazon.com and not a front in some third world country. And then also, from a customer, from the perspective of the seller, how do you know the customer really is a customer, and how that and how the balance between those two. And finally, the other big thing, and this is something that's still being developed, is this idea of regulatory. A lot of the way markets were established, your traditional commerce, there were definite rules of activity around laws, tax codes, trade agreements, things of that nature. An advantage of e-business is it cuts across a lot of that stuff. However, it doesn't necessarily eliminate it. All right. So, easily distributing, the ability to be able to do things simpler and cut things out does not necessarily rewrite the laws. So, a classic case, in particular with electronic music, like the digitization of music has become a big issue in terms of copyright, being able to maintain. Copyright was not. The copyright laws that are out there and that have been in effect, are really kind of built around a publishing model, and e-business really makes it a lot easier to replicate data, be able to do things at scale, and there's been challenges around, how do we maintain and enforce that? So and regulatory activity takes place at a much slower rate than the rate of technology change. Right, so becomes this is one of those areas that is very much under discussion, very much under evaluation even as we speak, around how these things, what the impact of some of this stuff is going to be. So if we look at some examples here, so this is some examples of businesses, but so there's like four, we would say business models, so there's like four distinct business models. What we call a business to business model, a business to consumer model, a consumer to business model, or a consumer to consumer model. Right. So, and quite frankly, these actually were in place. These are not necessarily e-business models. Business to business have been in effect for as long as there have been businesses. All right, business to consumer has been around as long as. So the e-business side of it. So there's the concept of a business model, and then there's the concept of the technology impact on the business model. So Lyft is a ride sharing type of sort of like a Uber, or I believe a competitor to Uber. So that'd be kind of a consumer to consumer sort of activity where an individual can make themselves a consumer, or a person would be a consumer is interacting one to one with another consumer, or this would be like an eBay would be another consumer to consumer, but it could also be a consumer to business. The models around these are, depending upon how you look at it and the way you look at it. For example, Etsy can either be considered a consumer to consumer, or a business to consumer sort of model, depending upon, I guess, who the person doing the manufacturing. You could have individuals doing stuff and selling things on Etsy, or you can have a larger business-oriented organization doing work on Etsy. The Gap is one of our traditional, business to consumer. An electronic supply chain would be an example of what we call business to business, where supplier, a raw material supplier, or intermediate or service supplier, providing resources and services to another organization. So business models are not necessarily technology driven, but they are impacted by the technologies some of the different types of technologies we're talking about. So as we look at here, Square, which can either be a business to business or business to consumer. Etsy, as we talked about, could be consumer to consumer, business to consumer. The Gap is traditional business to consumer. Airbnb is a consumer to consumer. Electronic supply chain would be business to business, and TaskRabbit would be either consumer to consumer or a consumer to business type of model. So one of the things, as if you look at e-business, e-business provides the ability for different types of revenue streams, revenue models. Um, the main, I mean, some of this stuff is traditional. These are actually, some of these things are actually traditional, some forms of revenue, but the e-business actually provides a new application for them. So in terms of advertising fees, we see organizations like Google, which has actually been able to find a way to generate a revenue stream out of search. So the idea is what you see with Google is they've actually have aligned their search engine capability with advertising. So if you perform a search on Google looking for a particular term, it is also possible for Google will people who are using in the field related to that term can actually create advertising, which will be delivered along with the contents, along with the search contents. And I mean they do it in a very subtle fashion. So you'll see it you'll see kind of at the beginning and at the end of the search results. Some entries that will have an ad in it, and that's actually an advertisement. If you click that, then there will be then basically there will be a fee charged by Google back to that organization that submitted the advertisement. This is actually Google's main revenue stream. They generate billions of dollars off of that. So it's pretty impactful. One of the big things around Google's strategy, like why do they give things away? Say, for example, the Chrome browser, they give that away. The Android operating system that goes in mobile phones, they give that away because their models are driven by people accessing and querying and developing potential opportunities to return advertising results. So they've been very successful with that. So that's one form. But licensing, obviously, the licensing of iTunes. One of the interesting things with iTunes was iTunes kind of came into play right after in the early 2000s after a lot of um, issues associated with Napster. So Napster was a music sharing business where people were taking songs off of their CDs and dropping them into a centralized repository, and then downloading music for free. Uh, Obviously, from a copyright perspective, from a an artist perspective, this was a significant disruptive activity. And one of the things that Apple did with the creation of iTunes was to kind of restructure that, kind of put it back into making it a revenue fee um, model. So so obviously the licensing, it was properly licensed music, but also kind of also packaged in an attractive fashion with attractive pricing, like 99 cents a song. Um, but they generated a very significant revenue stream off of that. And we see the other ones, these other subscription fees, traditional subscription fees. We've, the Wall Street Journal, but basically any New York Times, any publishing organization has, or content providers, transaction fees. So we see like Airbnb, which would be like I say, not really a hotel, but sort of a enabling people to put advertisements for rentals, and then taking a piece of it, basically charging a fee for um, a successful transaction. And then things like value-added service fees around things like Pandora. Amazon Prime, and others. Talk a little bit about advertising, just a little bit more about advertising, because this is actually a big portion of what you see with revenue on kind of the e-business was a lot of it was the big innovator was Google and what they call AdSense and AdWord. So Google enables companies to do is that you can bid on certain keywords, and for each click through, so for example, it will return as we said before, it returns a set of results, and then embedded in those results is actually advertisements, and if those advertisements get clicked, the advertiser will be charged for that, and generates a significant revenue for every click through they get. Play per call, the idea of a kind of a example of Credit Karma, the idea of providing a free service up front, but then also being able to take that interaction and use that to drive other services in credit card, loan, mortgage services, things of that nature. Pay per conversion would be the idea of actually pay per event. Right? You also call a pay per event. Basically, as they call gig master. So you can you basically have an event and tie a fee to that event. For every getting a portion of that, basically being serving as kind of a middle person for a establishment of gigs. And finally, pay per install. The idea of the big a couple different things with this. You see a lot with games. The idea of you have a game like Farmville, which would be an interactive game that also gives you the ability to provide for sales of tokens or whatever within the game. So significant amounts of actually kind of surprising how much money is actually generated through these game systems. So some of these are lucrative. Some of these things will have like life cycles. So some things will have will be big. We'll start off. We'll get big, and then maybe fade away. So so things like advertising, I think, tends to be a little bit more. I mean, these are different forms, but your traditional kind of a model that Google has put together has proven to be a pretty lucrative business model, and has been sustainable. So around collaboration. So collaboration, when we talk about communication and collaboration, the ability to use technology to provide communication in different forms for people to interoperate or interact, to do activities. So probably one of the most used. Some people would argue one of the most overused is email. Electronic mail has been around a while. It's probably one of the older, more mature platforms out there. But even 30 years on, very significantly used. 61% people say is very important. The internet in general, the ability to interact in different ways across the internet, particularly with social media. Instant messaging also been around. Actually, some fairly mature technology has taken on different forms. A lot of times, what we're seeing is instant messaging has now been embedded into social platforms, whereas before it was I think the original one was AOL's IM, which I think it was just phased. I think it was just phased out. It's just retired about a month or so ago, but has been superseded by all sorts of different instant messaging types of applications that are either built into the phone, into your phone, or into other social interaction types of sites. Podcasting, which is actually a growing area. So the ability to record I guess there's two parts. One is going to be your recording, your ability to create content, and then having an infrastructure to distribute it. So you'll see in like iTunes and other types of podcasting the ability to be able to create, upload, and then distribute um, communication. You recorded shows and kind of an interesting alternative to things like radio or for talking for interactions and discussions and education. Um, Video and web conferencing is an interesting. It's also been around a while, but becoming the mass connections to it has really probably been within about the past 10 years. So actually, it used to be video conferencing would require highly specialized equipment configurations to be able to go point to point from one company site to another. Now you've seen this thing has been distributed down to desktops, and with Skype or with FaceTime on the iPhone. The ability to do um, web conferencing, multiple web conferencing. Video conferencing, in particular like web meetings and things of that nature, are um, have become very sophisticated now. So the ability for people to interact effectively across wide distances has really become much more has become very possible. So you're seeing a lot of this in ranging from formal types of video conferencing setups down to like basically kind of collaborative interactions, both through through handhelds, through mobile, or through desktop. And I find content management, the ability to identify and store and manage large amounts of documents. So content management is as we get more and more documents, the ability to manage a lot of this stuff and be able to find it. Some of it is search, but some of it is categorization. Some of this stuff is there's a lot of different dimensions to content management, and it's a lot. You're seeing now. A lot of these things are kind of blending together in terms of interaction. So combined email, instant messaging, content management, and video conferencing, kind of different, one platform, one collaboration communication platform with different capabilities all kind of baked into it as opposed to individual applications. So collaboration technology. So this has been an ongoing development, over probably 10 to about past 10, 12 years. I think we've seen more of a lot of this more web-based collaboration tools standardized, and this is a lot of the stuff is like standardized tools. So like things like blogs and wikis. Um, Wikipedia being what a wiki is basically it's a document managed platform. Wikipedia is just an enormously large wiki, which growing up on a global scale, but basically you can use the same wiki technology to run something in a department. So it's not necessarily it scales from small to large. The idea of wikis are more around multiple collaboration, multiple people being able to log in, add content, update it, track, modify as needed. Blogs are more of a individual developing content and then publishing it. So more of a publishing kind of model. Content management, we talked about the ability to take different contents from different sources and be able to track it, control it, trace it, identify it. And then mashups are really a kind of a combination of the ability to take different types of information from different sources and combine it together and make it look as a seamless whole. You'll see a lot of things like aggregation sites. Like, for example, probably a good example would be a Zillow. which actually does an aggregation of real estate listings across different, um, creating a massive whole from individual data feeds from all sorts of different sites. But you can also a mashup is can be combines of different types of technology. So video and blogs and wikis and different things can be assembled together and created. What to be able to fit whatever you need, what you think you, depending upon your circumstances. And that is really it for chapter 3.